She opened the envelope the way she'd opened mail for 32 years, without fear, without hesitation. What she read sent her sliding to the kitchen floor, coffee still in her hand, shaking so hard the ceramic rattled against the hardwood. Their house, gone. But the house was just the beginning, because behind that letter was another secret, and behind that one another. 11 years, $400,000. A man she had slept beside every night, forging her name, feeding a machine that was eating her future alive, one quiet night at a time. She thought she knew him. She thought she knew her life. She was wrong about both. The hydrangeas along the front porch of the house on Briarcliff Road had never looked more beautiful than they did that April morning. Carol Whitfield stood at the kitchen window with her coffee mug cradled in both hands, watching the pale blue blooms sway gently in the warm Georgia breeze. And for a moment, just a moment, she let herself believe that everything was exactly as it appeared. She was 61 years old. Her hair, once the color of dark honey, had grown into a dignified silver that she wore in a loose bun most mornings. The lines around her eyes were the kind that came from decades of laughter and worry in equal measure. She had the hands of a woman who had worked, not in offices or behind counters, but in homes, in gardens, in the quiet, invisible labor that holds a family together. Hands that had changed diapers and planted tomatoes and signed school permission slips and pressed against a husband's chest in the dark when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. 32 years. She and Dennis had been married for 32 years. She met him in the summer of 1992 at a backyard barbecue in Decatur that a mutual friend had thrown on a Sunday afternoon hot enough to melt asphalt. Dennis Whitfield had been standing by the cooler in a pale blue polo shirt, laughing at something she couldn't hear. And when he turned and caught her looking, he didn't look away. He walked straight over with a cold Coca-Cola in each hand and said, "I figured you looked like a Coke person." She had laughed and taken the drink and never really stopped standing next to him after that. They married in October of 1993 at a small church in East Atlanta with 30 guests and a cake Carol's mother had baked herself. They were both 30 at the time, young enough to believe in forever without question, old enough to mean it. Dennis worked in commercial real estate. Carol had been a high school art teacher for 16 years before taking early retirement to care for her mother during her final illness. After that, she had stayed home, managing the household, the finances, or so she thought, and later helping raise their 2 grandchildren when their daughter Renee went through her divorce. Life had not been without its difficulties. There had been lean years in the late 90s when the real estate market dipped and Dennis's commissions dried up. There had been Renee's divorce, which tore through the family like a slow storm. There had been Carol's mother's death, and then Dennis's father's death, and the quiet grief that settles into a marriage after loss. But they had always come through. That was what Carol had always believed, that they were the kind of people who came through. The house on Briarcliff Road was the crown jewel of everything they had built. They had bought it in 2004 for $340,000. A 4-bedroom craftsman with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a backyard deep enough for a proper garden. Carol had loved it from the moment the realtor opened the front door. Over the years, she had repainted every room, refinished the floors, planted the hydrangeas, and built raised garden beds along the south fence where she grew tomatoes, peppers, and every variety of basil she could find at the farmer's market on Ponce de Leon. The plan had always been simple. Dennis would retire at 65. Carol would continue managing the home. Their savings, a combination of Dennis's 401k, a joint investment account, and the equity in the house, would be enough to carry them comfortably through their later years. They had spoken about it many times over dinner, over a morning coffee, in the easy shorthand of 2 people who have been planning a life together for so long that the plans feel like memory rather than projection. "We're going to be fine, Carol," Dennis used to say whenever she brought up money. "Stop worrying. Everything's taken care of." And she had believed him. That was the part that would haunt her later. Not the lies themselves, but the ease with which she had accepted his reassurances, the way she had handed over her trust, year after year, like coins dropped into a jar she never thought to count. It was their daughter Renee who first planted the seed of unease, though neither of them knew it at the time. It happened on a Thursday in early March, 6 weeks before that morning, with the hydrangeas and the coffee. Renee had stopped by unexpectedly, after picking up the grandchildren from school, Marcus, 12, and little Diane, 9, and while the kids raided the pantry, Renee had sat down at the kitchen table with an expression Carol recognized immediately. It was the look Renee wore when she was trying to say something she didn't know how to say. "Mom," she began, turning her coffee mug in slow circles on the table, "has Dad seemed different to you lately?" Carol had frowned. "Different how?" Renee hesitated. "I don't know. Distracted, maybe. I called him last week to ask about borrowing the truck for moving Diane's bedroom furniture, and he said he'd call me back. He never did, and when I called again, he seemed almost irritated, which isn't like him." Carol had dismissed it easily. Dennis had been under stress at work. There was a commercial property deal in Buckhead that had been dragging on for months, complicated by zoning issues and a difficult client. She had said as much to Renee, who had nodded and let the subject drop. But the seed had been planted. Over the following weeks, Carol began to notice small things she had previously overlooked. The way Dennis tensed slightly when she walked into the room while he was on his phone. The evenings he came home later than expected, offering explanations that were just detailed enough to sound rehearsed. The Sunday afternoon, he said he was going to the hardware store and came back 2 hours later with nothing in his hands. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was being paranoid, that decades of marriage did not simply unravel because of a few unexplained hours and attention she couldn't name. She had been through enough in life to know that not every shadow is a monster. But then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday morning in April, in a plain white envelope, from a law firm in Midtown Atlanta. Carol had been home alone. Dennis was at the office, and she had opened it, the way she opened all the mail, automatically, without ceremony. It took her 3 full readings to understand what she was looking at. It was a notice of foreclosure proceedings on the house on Briarcliff Road. Carol sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, not on the couch, but on the cold hardwood floor, and read the letter a 4th time, and then a 5th. Her coffee mug was still in her hand. She didn't realize she was shaking until she heard the ceramic rattle against the floor beside her. The house, their house. The house with the hydrangeas and the raised garden beds and the hardwood floors. She had refinished herself on a hot August weekend in 2011, while Dennis was at a conference in Charlotte. The house was being foreclosed, and Carol Whitfield, who had believed for 32 years that she knew everything about the life she was living, understood in that moment that she had known almost nothing at all. She did not confront him that night. She needed time, not to calm down because she was not sure she would ever be calm again, but to understand what she was confronting before she stood in front of it. Carol had always been that way. Deliberate, methodical. It was the quality that had made her an excellent teacher and a reliable mother, and she now understood with a cold, clear bitterness, an easy person to deceive. While Dennis ate the dinner she had mechanically prepared, baked chicken, roasted sweet potatoes, a salad she had assembled without tasting, she watched him from across the table and tried to reconcile the man in front of her with the letter folded in the pocket of her cardigan. He looked the same. He looked exactly the same as he had looked every night for 32 years. Gray at the temples now, a little softer around the middle, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, while he scrolled through his phone between bites. Familiar, ordinary, safe. The word made her stomach turn. After dinner, while Dennis watched television in the living room, Carol sat at the small desk in the spare bedroom, the room she used for her painting supplies and her grandmother's sewing machine, and began to look. She had always handled the day-to-day household bills, the utilities, the groceries, the insurance. Dennis had always managed what he called the big picture, the mortgage, the investments, the retirement accounts. It had been division of labor that felt natural, even sensible, for most of their marriage. Now, for the first time, Carol felt the full weight of how much she had deferred and how little she had questioned. She pulled up their joint bank account on her laptop. The balance was $412. She sat very still for a long time. Then she began to search further. The investment account they had opened in 2008, the one they had been contributing to steadily for 15 years. She found the login credentials in the small notebook she kept in the desk drawer. Dennis had always shared them with her, casually, as if the openness itself was proof of trustworthiness. The account had a balance of 0. Not low, not depleted, 0. Closed, the screen told her. Account closed in January. Carol closed the laptop and pressed her hands flat against the desk and breathed. She thought about all the times Dennis had told her not to worry. She thought about the vacations they had not taken in the last 3 years, which he had attributed to work demands. She thought about the Christmas 2 years ago when he had suggested they scale back gifts just this year, and she had agreed without question because she trusted him. She thought about last fall when she had mentioned wanting to repaint the exterior of the house, and he had said they should wait until spring, and then spring had come and he had changed the subject. She had trusted him, completely, irrevocably, the way you trust the ground beneath your feet. The next morning, after Dennis left for work, Carol called their daughter. Renee arrived within the hour. She sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, the foreclosure letter between them, and her face went through a series of expressions that Carol watched like weather passing across an open sky. Confusion, then disbelief, then a slow dawning horror that Carol recognized because she was still living inside it herself. "Mom," Renee said finally, "how long has this been going on?" "I don't know yet," Carol said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Together, they spent the morning pulling at threads. Renee, who worked as a paralegal, knew how to navigate financial records in ways Carol did not. By noon, the picture that emerged was far worse than the foreclosure letter had suggested. The mortgage, which should have had less than $60,000 remaining after 18 years of payments, had been refinanced twice without Carol's knowledge. The signatures on both refinancing documents, which Renee pulled out through the county records online, bore Carol's name. Carol stared at her own signature, or what was meant to look like it, and felt something shift permanently inside her. Not just betrayal, something older and colder than betrayal. The recognition that the ground had not just given way, it had never been solid. The money from the refinancing, nearly $200,000 across both transactions, had moved through a bank account Carol had not known existed. From there, the trail became harder to follow, but the destination was not difficult to guess. "Gambling," Renee said quietly, looking at a series of withdrawals made to casinos in Cherokee, North Carolina, and to what appeared to be online gambling platforms. Carol nodded. She had already arrived at the same conclusion. She thought about Dennis's trips to Charlotte for conferences. She thought about the evenings he had come home later than expected. She thought about the way he tensed when she walked in on him at his phone. She thought about 32 years of Sunday mornings and holiday dinners and grandchildren at the kitchen table, and she tried to locate the exact moment when the man she loved had started becoming a stranger. She could not find it. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all, that the deception had been so seamless, so perfectly woven into the fabric of ordinary life, that there was no seam visible anywhere. That evening, when Dennis came home, Carol was sitting at the kitchen table with the foreclosure letter in front of her. He saw it the moment he walked through the door. She watched his face, watched the recognition move through it, watched the mask slip just slightly before he pulled it back into place. "Carol," he began. "Sit down, Dennis," she said. He sat. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Carol had ever experienced in 32 years of marriage. Not because it was loud. It wasn't. It was almost eerily quiet. Carol asked questions, and Dennis answered them, and with each answer, the full architecture of the secret revealed itself beam by beam, like a condemned building being slowly dismantled. It had started, he said, about 8 years ago. A weekend trip to the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Cherokee with some colleagues from work. He had won $3,000 on the slot machines and felt, for the first time in years, completely and utterly alive. He had gone back the following month, and the month after that. Within 2 years, the casual trips had become compulsive ones. Within 4 years, he had burned through their investment savings. Within 6, he had refinanced the house, twice, using forged documents he had obtained through a contact he refused to name. In the last 2 years, he had lost most of that money as well, at casinos in Cherokee and at online gambling sites he accessed from his phone, often late at night, while Carol slept 10 feet away. "Why didn't you tell me?" Carol asked. It was the simplest question and the most unanswerable one. Dennis looked at the table. "Because I kept thinking I could fix it," he said. "I kept thinking the next time would be the wind that put everything back." Carol looked at her husband, at this man she had loved for 32 years, at this man who had built her a life and then quietly demolished it from the inside. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt sorry for him, and that terrified her more than the anger did. The days that followed were the strangest Carol had ever lived through. Dennis did not leave. Carol did not ask him to, not immediately. There was too much practical ground to cover, too many urgent and devastating realities that required both of them to be in the same room at the same time, however unbearable that was. The foreclosure proceedings were already underway. They had approximately 90 days before the house would be seized. Their joint bank account with its $400 was not enough to cover a month's rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, let alone 2 people rebuilding separate lives. Renee pushed for a lawyer immediately. She recommended a woman named Patricia Okafor, a family law attorney with an office in Midtown who had handled Renee's own divorce 4 years earlier. Carol made the appointment. Patricia Okafor was 54, sharp and measured in the way of someone who had spent decades sitting across from people in crisis and had learned to neither minimize nor catastrophize. She reviewed the documents Carol brought, the foreclosure notice, the refinancing records, the forged signatures, and when she looked up, her expression was careful but clear. "The forged signatures are significant," she said. "Depending on how your state handles this, there may be criminal liability on your husband's part. There's also the question of whether you can challenge the refinancing transactions given that your consent was fraudulent. That's a fight worth having. But I want you to understand up front, it's a long fight, and the outcome isn't guaranteed." Carol nodded. She had already accepted that nothing was guaranteed anymore. That particular illusion had been burned away completely. "What are my realistic options?" she asked. Patricia laid them out plainly. Divorce was the most straightforward path to financial separation and the clearest way to protect Carol from any future liability. Challenging the foreclosure on the basis of fraud was possible, but complicated and time-consuming. The forged signatures could potentially open a criminal case against Dennis, though Carol would need to decide whether she wanted to pursue that route. "Take some time," Patricia said. "This is a lot to process, but don't wait too long on the legal side. The foreclosure clock is already running." Carol thanked her and drove home through the afternoon Atlanta traffic on I-85, and somewhere between the Brookwood interchange and the Briarcliff exit, she pulled into a parking lot and cried for 20 minutes, in a way she hadn't cried since her mother died. She cried for the house. She cried for the retirement they would never have. She cried for the version of herself that had trusted so completely, for so long, without question. She cried for the 32 years that now felt like a painting, with the wrong colors underneath. Still real, still lived, but permanently altered by what she now knew. And then she stopped crying, because there was too much to do. Back at the house, she found Dennis in the living room. He had been home more than usual since the night of the conversation, calling in sick to work, sitting with a kind of stunned stillness that Carol recognized as the particular paralysis of a person whose secret has finally, irrevocably, become real. She had read enough about gambling addiction by now to understand some of what she was looking at. She understood intellectually that addiction was not a moral failing so much as a disease of the brain, that the dopamine loops and the compulsive behavior and the capacity for denial were not unique to bad people, but were in fact the defining symptoms of a condition that could take hold of almost anyone. Understanding it did not make it hurt less. I found a therapist, Dennis told her one evening, about a week after the conversation. A specialist in gambling addiction. His name is Dr. Marcus Webb. He's at Emory. Carol looked at him. Good, she said. Carol, I'm glad you're getting help, Dennis, she said. I mean that. But getting help doesn't fix the house. It doesn't fix the accounts. It doesn't... She stopped, started again. There are things that can't be undone by therapy. He knew that. She could see that he knew that. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said quietly. I want you to know I'm going to try. Itsikua. She nodded and went to bed and lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had slept in for 20 years, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant sound of a dog barking 2 streets over. And she tried to locate herself inside her own life. The person she had been 3 weeks ago seemed, from where she lay now, almost impossibly naive. Not stupid, as she had never been stupid, but naive in the specific way that comes from loving someone so completely that you stop asking whether the love is built on solid ground. She had extended trust the way a banker extends credit to a valued client, automatically, based on history, without checking the current balance. The current balance was 0. Her sister Barbara called from Savannah on a Sunday afternoon and listened for 2 hours without interruption, which was the most generous thing Carol could think of anyone doing. Barbara, who had been divorced twice and was now contentedly single in a cottage near Forsyth Park, did not offer easy comfort. You know what I kept thinking both times my marriages ended, Barbara said. I kept thinking I had wasted all those years. And then one day I stopped thinking that. Because those years weren't wasted. They were mine. The marriage being broken doesn't make the years not yours. Carol held that thought like a stone in her hand, turned it over, felt the weight of it. It helped in the complicated, insufficient way that true things sometimes help. Meanwhile, the practical machinery of crisis ground forward. Carol began working with Patricia Okafor to challenge the fraudulent refinancing transactions. She contacted a financial advisor, a woman named Susan Hartley, at an office on Peachtree Street to assess what, if anything, could be salvaged. The answer was grim, but not entirely hopeless. There was a small life insurance policy that had accumulated a modest cash value. There was the possibility of a settlement from the fraud challenge if it succeeded. There was Carol's eligibility for Social Security, which she could begin drawing in 4 years. She had not worked professionally in over a decade. Her teacher's pension was minimal. She had retired early, before the full vesting period. At 61, in Atlanta's competitive job market, re-entering the workforce was not a simple matter. But Carol Whitfield, who had managed a household and raised a daughter and planted a garden and built a life with her own 2 hands, was not a woman who was unfamiliar with hard work. She was just a woman who had forgotten for a while that the hard work had always been hers to do. It was Renee who found the second account. Carol had thought there was one hidden account, the one through which the refinancing money had flowed. But in the process of preparing documentation for the fraud challenge, Renee, working with a forensic accountant, Patricia Okafor, had recommended, discovered a second account at a different bank. This one had been open for 11 years. The money that had moved through it, in and out, in the irregular, desperate rhythm of a compulsive gambler chasing losses, totaled over the 11 years just over $400,000. $400,000. Carol read the number on the forensic accountant's report and had to put the paper down and walk out to the backyard and stand among her garden beds for a long time before she could go back inside. $400,000. The sum of their working lives. The retirement they had planned over dinner tables and in quiet Sunday morning conversations. The future she had believed in so completely and for so long that it had felt less like a plan than a fact. Gone, not lost in a market crash or a medical crisis or any of the ordinary disasters that life can produce without malice, gone through the deliberate, repetitive, secret acts of the man she had shared a bed with for 3 decades. She called Patricia Okafor that afternoon. "I want to know every legal option I have," she said. "All of them." "Including the criminal route?" Patricia asked. Carol thought of Dennis in the living room, pale and shrunken, going to therapy 3 times a week, not eating much, sleeping badly. She thought of the man at the barbecue in Decatur with the 2 cold Coca-Colas and the easy laugh. She thought of 32 years and what they contained. Real things, true things, love that had been genuine, even when the ground beneath it was hollow. "Tell me what it would mean," she said. "What it would involve," Patricia explained. Forgery of legal documents in Georgia was a felony. Financial fraud of this magnitude carried significant penalties. A criminal complaint combined with the civil fraud challenge would likely result in serious consequences for Dennis. It would also be a long, painful, public process. It would involve their daughter. It would involve their grandchildren, eventually. "I'm not telling you what to do any quicker," Patricia said. "I'm giving you the information you asked for." "I know," Carol said. "Thank you." She did not make a decision that day. Instead, that evening, she did something she had not done in weeks. She went to her spare room, her painting room, and she took out her supplies and she sat down in front of the blank canvas she had been meaning to work on since the previous fall. She did not paint anything in particular. She just moved color across the surface the way she always had when she needed to think without words, following instinct, following feeling, letting the image emerge from somewhere below conscious thought. What emerged slowly over 2 hours was something she hadn't expected. A door, slightly ajar, with light coming through the gap. Behind her, in what she was painting, was darkness. Ahead, the light, uncertain, undefined, but unmistakably there. She sat back and looked at it for a long time. The confrontation she had been dreading came the following week, and it did not happen the way she had anticipated. She had expected Dennis to continue in his stunned, diminished state indefinitely. She had not expected him to come to her. He knocked on the door of the painting room one evening, something he rarely did, respecting that space as hers. And when she told him to come in, he entered slowly. Like a man walking into a room he wasn't sure he deserved to be in. He sat down in the old armchair in the corner, the one covered in paint-spattered fabric that Carol had always meant to reupholster and never had. "I want to tell you everything," he said, "not to ask for forgiveness. Just because you deserve to know the whole truth, not the version I've been telling." She turned her chair to face him and said nothing. Waited. What followed was an hour unlike any other in their 32-year marriage. Dennis talked, slowly, painfully, stopping and starting, about the first time he had felt the pull, about the way the casino had felt like the only place where the pressure of his life, the clients, the deal, the fear of not being enough, had simply dissolved, about the shame that had grown in exact proportion to the losses, about the refinancing, not minimized now, not explained away, but laid out in plain, ugly detail, about the forged signatures, which he had done himself using a kit he had ordered online, about the lies, all of them, the conference trips, the hardware store, the late evenings, 32 years worth of small and large untruths, stripped of all their dressing. He did not cry. She had expected him to cry, but he didn't. He spoke with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who had finally run out of ways to hide. When he finished, Carol sat quietly for a moment. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she said finally. "It's not the money. I could have survived losing the money, if we lost it together. If you'd come to me and told me what was happening and we'd faced it together." "I know," he said. "You made me invisible," she said, "in my own life. You made decisions about my home and my future and my name on legal documents. And you made them as if I wasn't even there, as if I didn't exist in the equation." He bowed his head. "Yes," he said, "I did." The silence between them was long and full and necessary. "I've spoken to a lawyer," Carol said. "I'm going to pursue the civil fraud challenge on the refinancing. And I've decided not to file a criminal complaint, not because what you did wasn't criminal, but because I don't want to spend the next 3 years of my life in a courtroom watching you be prosecuted. I want to spend them rebuilding mine." Dennis looked up. There was something in his face. Relief, yes, but also something more like grief. The grief of a person who understands exactly what they have lost and has no argument to make against the loss. "I'm going to need you to cooperate fully with the civil case," Carol continued. "Sign whatever Patricia needs you to sign. Provide whatever documentation she asks for. No resistance, no delays." "Of course," he said immediately. "And Dennis," she said. Her voice did not waver. "I'm filing for divorce." He nodded. He had known it was coming. She could see that he had known. "I'm not filing because I stopped loving you," she said quietly. "I'm filing because I have to live the rest of my life as myself. Not as the woman who trusted you. As myself." Dennis Whitfield looked at his wife of 32 years, at the woman who had planted hydrangeas and raised their daughter and believed in him without reservation for 3 decades, and he said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. He simply nodded and accepted it. And for the first time in a long time, that honesty was the truest form of respect he had shown her. The house on Briarcliff Road sold at auction in July. Carol was not there when it happened. She had said her goodbye to it on a Tuesday morning in late June, 2 weeks before the auction date, walking through every room one last time, with a slowness that was deliberate and necessary, the way you read the last pages of a book you love and don't want to end. She ran her hand along the kitchen counters and the original crown, molding in the hallway, and stood for a long time at the back door, looking out at her garden. The tomatoes were coming in. There were peppers on the plants. The hydrangeas along the front porch were in their fullest bloom, the pale blue she had always loved best, nodding in the summer heat. She took cuttings. The gardening center on Ponce de Leon had told her that hydrangeas could be propagated from cuttings if you did it right, if you were patient and careful, and gave them time to root. She wrapped them in damp paper towels and placed them carefully in a box, and she carried them out to her car the way you carry something irreplaceable. Then she closed the door of the house on Briarcliff Road for the last time and drove away. She had found an apartment in Decatur, a 2-bedroom on the second floor of a building 3 blocks from the farmers' market she had shopped at for 20 years. The apartment had southern exposure and good light, and a small balcony where, Renee had pointed out practically, container gardening was entirely possible. The months that followed were not simple. There is no honest version of this story in which the rebuilding is easy or swift or uninterrupted by grief and doubt. There were nights when Carol lay awake in the unfamiliar apartment, in the dark that still felt wrong after a lifetime of a different dark, and the losses came at her in waves. The house, the retirement, the future she had mapped so carefully, the version of her marriage that had existed only in her own mind. But there were also mornings. She had taken a part-time position teaching art at a community center in East Atlanta. 2 afternoons a week, working with adults, most of them older than her students had been, but no less hungry to learn. The pay was modest. The satisfaction was not. She had begun painting again in earnest. In the light-filled second bedroom she had designated her studio. The painting with the door and the light, the one she had made the night before, telling Dennis she was filing for divorce, hung above her desk, and she looked at it every morning and thought about what it meant to choose the light, even when you could not yet see clearly what lay on the other side. The civil fraud challenge, as Patricia had warned, was slow. But in November, 7 months after Carol had found the foreclosure letter on the kitchen table, the judge ruled in her favor on the fraudulent refinancing claims. The ruling did not restore everything. It could not, but it resulted in a settlement that gave Carol enough to establish a modest but stable financial footing going forward, combined with her Social Security eligibility and the small pension. She would not retire in the comfort she had imagined, but she would not be destitute. She would be, as Barbara had said on the phone one afternoon, with characteristic bluntness, okay, which is more than a lot of people get, and you're smart enough to build on okay. Barbara was right. Carol had always known her sister was right about most things. Dennis was in treatment. He had moved into a small rental house in Chambly, and was attending a Gamblers Anonymous program 3 times a week, in addition to his sessions with Dr. Marcus Webb at Emory. Renee kept Carol updated, not because Carol had asked her to, but because Renee was the kind of daughter who understood instinctively what her mother needed to know and what she didn't. Carol was glad Dennis was in treatment. She hoped it helped him. She thought about him sometimes, not with bitterness, not with the burning anger she had expected to carry indefinitely, but with something more complicated, the particular sadness of loving someone you can no longer trust your life to. She had told her grandchildren in the careful, age-appropriate way she and Renee had agreed on, that Grandma and Grandpa were living separately now. Marcus, 12 and perceptive, had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Are you okay, Grandma?" And Carol had said with complete honesty, "I'm working on it, sweetheart, and yes, I think so." Marcus had nodded with the solemn seriousness of a child who understands that adults carry weight, and then asked if she would teach him to make her baked chicken, which he had always loved. She had said yes. They had spent a Saturday afternoon in her apartment kitchen, Marcus following instructions with the focused intensity of someone who takes cooking as seriously as Carol always had. And by the time the chicken came out of the oven, golden and fragrant and exactly right, Carol had laughed more genuinely than she had in months. The hydrangea cuttings had taken root. She had planted them in large containers on the balcony in late June, following instructions she had found at the library, and cross-referenced with the woman at the gardening center on Ponce de Leon. They had required patience, weeks of careful watering and indirect light, and the particular faith required to tend something that shows no outward sign of progress, while it quietly builds its root system underground. By October, they were leafing out properly. The gardening center woman said they would likely bloom the following spring. Carol stood on the balcony on a cool October afternoon, coffee mug in hand, and looked at the containers with their small determined plants, and thought about patience, about the specific courage required to plant something, knowing you will not see it bloom for months, about how much of her life she had spent tending things that grew slowly, invisibly, in ways that required faith before they required evidence. She had not wasted 32 years. Barbara was right about that too. The years had been real. The love had been real, even when it had been built on ground that was quietly giving way beneath the surface. Carol Whitfield had lived those years fully and genuinely, had brought herself to them completely, and that could not be taken away by a foreclosure notice or a fraud judgment, or the particular cruelty of a secret kept too long. What had been taken was the future she had imagined, and that, she was slowly understanding, was not the same as the future itself. The future was still there, smaller than she had planned for, differently shaped, requiring new tools and new blueprints and a willingness to build in ways she had not anticipated at 61. But there, on a Saturday morning in early December, Carol Whitfield set up her easel in the apartment studio and began a new painting. She did not plan it out in advance the way she sometimes did. She simply began with color, a deep, warm gold at the center, expanding outward into something more complex and layered at the edges. She worked for 3 hours without stopping, lost in the particular silence of making something from nothing. And when she stepped back to look at what she had created, she felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has remembered after a long time of forgetting what they are capable of. The painting was not finished. It would take several more sessions to complete, but the core of it was there, clear and luminous in the morning light coming through the south-facing window, something new taking shape in her hands, exactly as she had always known how to do. Carol Whitfield made herself a cup of coffee, sat down in the chair by the window, and looked at the containers on the balcony, where her hydrangeas were quietly, patiently building their roots. She thought about spring, and for the first time in 8 months, the thought of it didn't hurt. It felt, instead, like something worth waiting for.